Well, Ken, thank you so much for helping with my project. Could you say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Ken Fountain. I am a freelance journalist, currently working for a nonprofit, doing a newsletter for them and at various other sundry editing jobs, writing jobs. Former Navy. Behind me, you can see a painting that my father did of the ship that I served on. You can't see it well because of my lighting here, but that's the USS Ranger. It was an aircraft carrier. It was decommissioned it was decommissioned in the 90s, but it was demolished 5 years ago. It was taken apart. Um, and I know you because of we've met through various science space events at Rice and other places. And I'm one of the organizers of the Houston Science Enthusiasts meetup group.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you put that together. It's been such a collection point of all of the different science activities in the Houston area. And I think the more that people know about it, the more they're interested. The more they're interested, there's more that there is. And it's just like kind of like this virtuous circle.
Yeah, that's the idea. In fact, I didn't create the group. It was created by someone else about 10 years ago. But about 5 years ago, it was going kind of defunct, and the people who had started kind of faded away. And I took it over because I thought Houston needed one meetup group that was like devoted to all of science, not just. I mean, you do a great job with your particular one, but I thought there should be one place where all kinds of science could be disseminated through.
I know it's alerted me to a lot of events I've been happy that I've been able to go to. So it's
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
So when did you find out that we're going back to the moon?
Um, I guess it was when the current administration announced that program. I've known about the talks about whether or not to go to discussion about whether to go to Mars first or the moon first, and that's been going on for several years, and I knew about those discussions, but I guess that was when I first heard that there was an actual plan to do so.
And my original plan with this project was to interview people at coffee shops on the street, everyday people, to find out if they knew about it and what they thought about it. And I did that before March, and then after March has all been Zoom meetings
Yeah.
since then. Would it surprise you that most people that I've talked to that aren't in the space community know that we're going back to the moon?
You're saying that most people do know that?
I do. Sorry, I put so many clauses in there. Who knows what I
Okay.
was saying? But would it surprise you that most people
Yeah.
have no clue that we're going back to the moon?
Uh-oh. That doesn't surprise me. As a journalist, I know that many people don't even know a lot about what's going on in current events, the political realm, that kind of thing, who the vice president is. So it doesn't really surprise me. Space science is a fairly uh, unique interest, I think, and so it wouldn't surprise me that most people don't really know that.
It's interesting, because I feel like we used to have like Star Trek that even people who didn't watch Star Trek knew about and was kind of driving forward the narrative of humanity expanding out into space and meeting other civilizations and things like that.
Yeah.
But it seems like with all the different sci-fi movies and just the way that Netflix and Amazon and you can watch whatever you want whenever you want, I think means that there's a lot more out there for everybody, but there's nothing like Star Trek that's really driving the narrative in the same way. And I was wondering if you felt the same way or what your thoughts were.
Um, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, we live in a much more diverse media culture anyway. But yeah, you're right. When I was growing up, and you and I were growing up, Star Trek, and then later Star Wars were the sort of the two big science fiction, you know, tent poles that people kind of hung their hat on. That's what got me interested in science fiction or into space science. Was I got to it through Star Wars first, then going back to Star Trek, and then Cosmos with Carl Sagan was a big influence on me. So it was sort of a gateway drug into space science.
We need more gateway drugs like that.
Yeah.
Um, so what do you think about us going back to the moon? I mean, what's your opinion?
I think it's great. I was open to both arguments, whether to go to Mars first or the moon first. I think the moon first um, uh, policy is a good way to approach it. Learn things, learn new technologies, learn new procedures before we make that bigger leap. So I'm all for it.
Yeah, the one thing that really strikes me as I read like books about astronauts and about mission controllers and people in the space program is just the army of people here on Earth that are supporting the people in space. Like if they have trouble with, their water recycling unit, they get to tell somebody on Earth that problem, and then they figure out the solution and they communicate that back to the people in space.
Yeah.
And as I think about as these people are getting further and further away from the Earth, and it becomes like 10, 15 minutes communication delay, the ability of people on Earth to support in real time really diminishes, and
Mm, yeah.
it's like even though you can send the people, they're losing their kind of like these resources that are backing them up, and I don't think we're quite um, have internalized the implications of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I've not thought about, but it's a good point. I mean, but one thing it also works in reverse. I mean, there's been so much application of science of space technology to real world problems. I remember early in the pandemic, a group of NASA affiliated scientists worked to create something related to helping in the pandemic. I can't remember exactly. Some engineering piece of technology that they came up with, and they worked around the clock for about 3 weeks and created a real product that could help people right now here on Earth. So it has its benefits both ways, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm a lot of people I've talked to are excited and they're glad that we're doing it. I even heard one person kind of say, the government wastes money on so much. At least now they're spending on something that might inspire people. So you have that view, but you also kind of have that prioritization and opportunity cost conversation come up a lot. Like, how can we spend all this money to go to space and send astronauts to space whenever we have poverty and global justice issue and climate change, and how do you sort through that kind of issue?
Um, what? About 10 years ago, I went to see Neil deGrasse Tyson at U of H. In fact, I didn't know a whole lot about him before I saw him there, and he talked about that, and he talked about how um, going to space, going to other worlds, is a way to it's sort of the moral equivalent of war, as someone has put it. Maybe he put it in the same terms, but you can devote resources to a project that will inspire people as opposed to devoting those same resources to making weapons of war. I also remember during the I guess 2 years ago when we had the celebration of, well, a year and a half ago, celebration the 50th year anniversary of Apollo 11. I didn't know this full story, but there was a black minister, a very prominent black minister, who brought some people down to the Cape to watch the launch. And first, they were going there to protest the launch, and they talked to people, officials at NASA, and this is all on film. And they registered this opinion that we shouldn't be going to the moon when we have people in dire straits here on Earth. And and they were listened to, and they made their case. And then they also went to see the launch. And there's a tight shot in the footage of that minister looking up at the launch, and just his face is filled with awe. And so I think when you explain to people the actual breakdown, the actual expenditures, and how the the NASA budget has always been a pittance compared to the entire federal budget. I mean, I think people can process that, can be made be understood.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that our government is actually going to be spending more per year for the next foreseeable future, kind of refreshing our nuclear arsenal,
Hmm.
which has the very purpose of destroying our world.
Right,
It
right.
seems like even if NASA and space exploration comes out to be neutral, it still would be better than spending it on nuclear weapons.
Yeah. But the other thing is, I think people just don't. People who are not science geeks like you and I are, it's hard, I guess, to convey that message. But you just have to keep working at it.
I've heard a couple of people, not many, but it caught me off guard. So it's like a sampling issue in the sense of how it resonates in my mind. But some people have said, oh, we've messed up the Earth. We shouldn't go to the moon and mess up the moon too.
Hmm. Yeah, well, we absolutely have to be careful. Any place we go, we need to be careful about how we treat the environment. Um, I don't know, since the moon is a fairly barren place, I don't know how much damage we can do to it really, but 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 we have to be careful, obviously.
Yeah, and that's the part that challenges me too, is that I always think of pollution in terms of its impact on life.
Hmm.
Like, if you're polluting an ocean, the problem with it, you're killing the sea life. And so when there is no life to, cause harm to, is it even possible
That
to
we know of.
pollute
That we know
that we
of.
know of? Yeah. And, that's a good point. We're kind of going out there with all these preconceived ideas, and we have to be open to the unexpected.
Yeah, did you just see the news today that scientists have discovered some sort of precursor chemical in Titan's atmosphere that could lead to life?
I did not.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, and they found the same thing. Well, they found something similar in the atmosphere of Venus just a few weeks ago. So it might be more prominent than we think.
I I think it's, life is something that once you get going, and the way that microbes are just literally everywhere, it seems like it's only a matter of time before the universe is filled with life.
Right. What's that old quote from Jurassic Park? Life will find a way,
Absolutely. Yeah, the only question is it going to be human life, or is it just going to be the microbes?
Yeah.
So when you look at humanity 500 years in the future, what do you see? Like optimistically, what would you like to see? I guess is better question.
Well, getting back to Star Trek, I was just thinking about this after you asked me to do this today. Star Trek, I was a teenager when I first watched that and kind of a geeky kid, kind of a idealistic kid, and it posits a future that Earth has gotten its act together. We've unified as a people, and now we're exploring space. And I guess that's always been in the back of my mind. That's where we should be headed. I also remember that Arthur C. Clarke wrote like 3 or 4 sequels to 2001, and one of the later ones was, I think it was set in 20,001, and at that time, all of the through intermingling of people over eons, there were no races anymore. Everyone was sort of like a brownish kind of hue. There was not multiple races, and we were just a much more together as a species. And I think that's still what I hope for.
But I just wonder, you know, right now you have kind of mass migrations and intermixing across the world because, uh, we have air travel and pretty much to a large extent, most people in like Japan, Europe, and North America can move amongst themselves and even to other places. But I wonder, uh, I mean, do you see humanity expanding beyond the Earth in a meaningful way, having like millions and maybe even billions of people living off the planet?
Oh yeah, I've always thought that's where we're headed. And we sort of have to if we're going to survive, if we're going to exist as a species. We will exhaust the Earth in some time. I don't know when that will be, but and it's just it's just as a species we've always been explorers, and so it's just a natural progression of what we've always been.
And I gotta think, considering different gravitational fields and considering sort of like the different growing environments that people that have spent generation after generation, on Mars are in the belt, are, the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, that they're going to kind of develop different physical characteristics than people on Earth. And
Yeah, there's a guy at Rice, you've probably seen him before, named Scott Solomon. Um, he's given talks about this very subject, that we will. there'll be human beings who are different than the way we are today. And
Yeah,
whether or not you still can call them human beings, Homo sapiens, there'll be different branches of humanity.
and maybe race isn't going to be defined by color, but by tallness or shortness or
Right,
stoutness or
right. The
kind of like
size of the head. Have those big skulls like they had in Star Trek.
exactly. I mean, I gotta imagine that these people that are living in free fall become much more used to using their feet in ways that
Mm,
people on the earth may not.
yeah.
That maybe they just become another set of hands, and um, yeah, just kind of interesting to think about. But uh, so, when did you first get onto the internet? Like, do you remember about what year or decade it was?
I was living in California when the internet first hit, like in 94, 95, and I was staying with some people there, and they had the internet. I think that's the first time I used it, but I didn't start using it myself until I came back to Houston, and that would have been in 95. And I first only used it at college at U of H at the library. And then we finally had it installed at home. So early on, but you know, it's been a steady progression ever since then.
Yeah, I feel like the 1990s were transformational in terms of telecommunications and computing. And, you know, I just, some of the things that were commonplace in 2000, like email and the web browser and online shopping and all these other things. I'm just trying to imagine, like, thinking back to 1990, just a decade before,
Hmm.
and trying to explain people what these things were. I mean, imagine doing that. I think they would have a much easier time understanding quantum mechanics than email at that point. And
Right, right.
I was wondering if you felt the same way, if the 1990s were that transformational.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you could not have imagined in 1990. I could not have imagined really that we would be sending messages forth back and forth over computer screens. Maybe I could have imagined that, but just the how fast it's progressed, I don't know that what you and I are doing here right now. That would have been fairly unimaginable unless you were a science fiction geek and you saw it in Star Wars or Star Trek. So,
Yeah, and the reason I bring that up is because I feel like that we have the drivers in place that the 2020s could be just as transformational for space exploration. That
mhm,
in 2030, you'll have Starship flying, and you'll have hundreds of people traveling around the globe in matter of 30 minutes or less, and people going to orbit on a daily, if not hourly basis, and people going to the moon, and people on their way to Mars. And you have Blue Origin, and you have like the 14 commercial lunar payload services companies, which one of them, Astrobotics, I've paid to send. Um, oops, that's not the right one. I paid to send this a micro SD card, which I'm putting this video on,
mhm.
to the moon next summer. So we should tell people that the static on your side is not from the radiation damaging the micro
Yeah,
SD card.
yeah.
Uh, but um, I mean that. I mean, could you imagine actually sending anything to the moon a few years ago? Now you could actually pay um, DHL, which is ultimately paying Astrobotic, to send things to the moon. And you're going to have like these 14 companies with the capabilities of landing stuff on the moon. NASA's paying the primary cargo fee, but that leaves a whole bunch of space for other things that universities and uh, companies can do. Um, we're going to have a worldwide high-speed, low-latency internet within like the year, all
Yeah.
over the world. Um, and I think space mining and space resource extraction is going to be something that we see. And I feel like people are going to look at the 2030s and see some things that they do and take for granted that we just can't explain or understand today. And I was wondering if you felt like the 2020s might work out like that.
Well, I hope so. I hope that you know, the political movement we or the political atmosphere we have, not just in this country but across the world, seems pretty dire right now. Um, and again, getting back to Star Trek, that if you remember in the show, the 1990s, I guess, was or early 2000s when there was a series of wars, and that was finally when Earth decided to finally come together. It feels like we're in a kind of that we're not in physical wars, but we're in that kind of moment right now. But as Tyson said in that speech I heard a decade ago, you know, exploring space, exploring science, technology does have a way, I think, of bringing people to reach for their higher selves. That's what I'm hoping is that we can start doing that again.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And if it was safe and affordable, would you go into space?
I would, I would in a moment. It would be no question. Yeah,
Have you heard of this reality TV show that's in the works called Space Hero?
I've not heard about that. What is that?
They're still sort of in the planning stages, but the plan is to do a global contest to select an individual to go into the International Space Station for 10 days.
Wow.
Um, and there's been lots of talk about similar types of things that turned out to be, didn't actually materialize. Maybe some of them scammy, maybe some of them were just delusional. The thing that gives me hope here is that Axiom Aerospace, which has a contract with SpaceX and agreements with NASA to actually send people to International Space Station, um, and who's sending Tom Cruise next year to film a movie up there,
Yeah, I
is
did hear about that. Yeah.
is going to be the provider for transporting them up there. So that in my mind gives it a lot more credibility than it would otherwise.
Well, you've got Tom Hanks on board, or is it Tom? It's Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise, yeah.
Right, right.
Um, would you participate in the reality TV show if you could?
I don't know. I'm leery of that entire realm of entertainment. So, I guess I would have to think about that a couple of times before I actually agree to that. But if it was a way that I could participate, because I'm a journalist, I would go if I could like write about it or do something journalistic about it.
Yeah, that would be neat. I kind of provide an insider's perspective to outer space. Um, well, are there any other things you would like to talk about? I kind of envision this as both being a learning project for myself and a chance to get out there and find out what people are thinking when it comes to space, but I also see it as a time capsule. And in
Mhm.
my mind, I see this high school student that was born on the moon, having to put together this research paper about what people were thinking right before the new space age. And this set of videos is like resource material for her paper.
Mhm.
And so, what would you say to that high schooler 100 years from now?
Well, I guess first thing I would say was I'm glad that you're there because that means that we made it out of our current situation alive. So that's a good thing. But sort of, more seriously, if you remember when we celebrated the Apollo 11 anniversary a couple of years ago, a lot of people were talking about how that was during a similar time in our history when we were a very divided country, a very divided populace. The world was between two camps, the Russians and us, and various allies. And that moment when we landed on the moon was a moment that unified not just Americans but the entire world. And it sounds kind of hokey, but I think I think people who are interested in science and space are kind of optimistic by nature, even when things are looking pretty dire. And so I have hopes that we are going to make it there, and I'm glad that we did to that young girl.
That's a really inspirational message. And, as you were talking, it occurred to me that the reason people who are into science and stuff have an optimistic future is because I think most of them are problem solvers. And so
Yeah.
it's like the more difficult and dire things become, I kind of the more optimistic they become because they're like, oh, more problems to solve.
Right, right. And I'm not a scientist, but I've always been interested, highly interested in science, and so I've always been interested in that side of things. Using knowledge to solve problems is a good thing.
I know, and to think about the fact that since the time we first landed on the moon, we've doubled the population of the Earth. I mean, that means we've like double the number of brains on the Earth. That we
Yeah.
we have double the number of brains to solve problems with more access to information to each other than ever before. What's keeping us um, from solving all these problems? I mean, it seems like we have the capacity.
Well, you asked me about the internet earlier, and when the internet first started to hit, people were very optimistic about that very thing. That we would all just spend our time going to museums across the world and that kind of thing. We'd had all this knowledge, and that's all we would do. But of course, like any tool, the internet can be used for good purposes and bad purposes. And since I'm in the media, I've been doing a deep dive into the whole fake news phenomena and propaganda, and those are things that have always existed. We just have applied them using new technologies that make it easier to disseminate bad information. And unfortunately, there are people, all of us really are susceptible to bad information, based on our own biases from time to time. But there's just a lot more ease of access for people who want to do those things. And so, you know, it's just a question of human nature and how to best kind of deal with these new phenomena, these new tools in a way that, pardon me, that does the least harm and does more good.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like we're on the right path though, because between like the targeted content, kind of reinforcing people's already held beliefs just to be able to suck in the attention of people, and then also advertising, trying to understand and promote things, you know, just to promote things. I mean, there's real money and expertise and stuff behind that, and there's a real driver to completely manipulate people's opinion and buying patterns and everything. What's the counterbalancing force that will cause that to change?
I've always been of the opinion that good information will ultimately drive out bad information. Um, Sometimes that feels like a highly idealistic stance, but I just feel like over time people are going to get tired. In this pandemic, early on, I thought it would lead people to people who kind of rejected science previously. I kind of thought, well, this is a time when people are going to want to pay attention more to science, and they will accept science more readily. And unfortunately, we've seen that it's been politicized, and so people who have agendas that would require them to discount science have been pushing that narrative. And so my hopes in the beginning have kind of been have faded somewhat since then. But I still, like I said, I still feel like ultimately people will want to know what's real, and they'll look to sources that tell them what's real as opposed to what tell them even what they want to believe. Because I think that's what the big problem is. People may not even necessarily believe the things that they put out there, but it rings true with them emotionally, and that's why they want to believe things, and so they will make themselves believe things even when they rationally know it's probably not true.
Yeah, it's just it's one thing to argue over the interpretation of facts. It's another thing to argue about, is anything actually true?
Right, right.
That, and it seems like we're so far down that aisle. Like, yeah, people just really aren't um, and kind of really thinking things through, it doesn't feel like.
Well, I also think, and because I ingest media all day long, that's what I do. Uh, I know that I can project on the people who disagree with me, um, attitudes that they may not have, and I also know that people who like me or adjusting media all day long kind of tend to see the world in those terms all the time. But I know that lots of other people, many probably more people, aren't ingesting media all day long, and so they're sort of tuned out of this discussion in large part, and they're not really fighting, or they're not paying attention to the fight, not paying as much attention to the fights that I'm paying attention to, and it doesn't really penetrate them as much as it does me, if that makes sense. I think I kind of didn't get around to what I was saying very clearly, but I hope that made some sense.
Yeah, also it's kind of interesting. I think with this COVID-19 thing, there's a lot of people that were listening to the radio on their commute to work and to home who probably have changed their consumption of media and what have
Yeah,
you, and are probably a lot more isolated than.
that's actually been proven true that like people who listen to NPR on their commutes have not been listening to NPR as much, and so their ratings are down and their fundraising has been down this past few months.
Wow, and that's been like probably a national phenomenon.
Yeah,
Um, so
yeah, other media as well.
that's something else. Well, Ken, I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for helping me with my project. If you know other people that would be willing to have a conversation about the future, I have over 1,500 more days to go till the end of 2024.
Yeah. Well, okay,
So
I'll tell you what. I will put out a message through the science meetup group and tell them how they can contact you.
that would be fantastic. Okay, well, you have a good evening, and
Okay, I had a good time. Thanks very much.
thank you so much, Ken.
Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.